What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be talking about some of the top waiver wire targets heading into week 9 of the NFL season, some players who can contribute right away, maybe some players that are stashes, could have some upside sometime in the second half of the season. If you guys enjoy, hit that like button, subscribe. Any questions, drop them down below. Keep in mind that these are going to be players who are rostered in 40% or fewer leagues using the ESPN waiver wire. But let's just dive right into my number one pickup this week. Seems pretty clear. It is going to be Cedric Tillman, who's rostered in 16% of leagues. And we saw Jameis Winston step in and just completely revive this offense. He comes in, 27 completions, 334 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, and Cedric Tillman had an absolutely monster day. 9 targets, 7 receptions, 99 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. In his first 6 games this season, he had 3 total receptions for 9 yards. In his last 2 games, games where Jameis Winston has played a lot in, he has 15 receptions for 180 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns. I think he's definitely an interesting option with Jameis at quarterback. Now, is Jameis going to throw for 300 plus, 3 touchdowns every single game? No, he's going to have some clunkers. We know he's very boom or bust. Can have these monster days, can also have some lesser performances. But even in the games where he's struggling, throwing interceptions, I still think there's going to be a decent amount of volume. We saw that with his time in the Bucs. He can throw 30 picks, but if you're throwing those picks, setting your team back, you're going to have to come back in those games, which is still going to lead to a lot of passing volume out of Jameis. So Tillman's interesting. Young player starting to break out here. Clearly has some chemistry with Jameis Winston. I think he's a very interesting pickup at the wide receiver position. Another young wide receiver who I think is a fun pickup is going to be Ricky Pearsall, rostered in 22.4% of leagues. And in your more competitive leagues, he's probably going to be rostered. But I would just keep an eye on him potentially getting dropped, especially with the 49ers on bye. Maybe a team needs a replacement. They need a quarterback, a tight end, whatever it may be. Ricky Pearsall, if he's not available now, could get dropped and you pick him up on that second wave. But last night, Ricky Pearsall was targeted 4 times, caught all 4 of them for 38 receiving yards, and he also had 39 yards on the ground. So he's out there, he's making plays. Close to 80 yards in your second NFL game after coming back from being shot. I'd say that's a pretty impressive performance out of Pearsall. You look at this 49ers wide receiver room, they've dealt with a lot of injuries. Brandon Ayuk obviously out for the year. You have Deebo Samuel, who's been banged up. Now he's dealing with some sort of rib injury. Not sure the severity of that. He does have the bye, but it seems like it's been something almost every single week with Deebo. And then you have Juwan Jennings, who's also dealing with a hip injury, did not play last night. So it's possible Deebo's healthy, Juwan Jennings comes back, and Ricky Pearsall kind of takes a step back in this offense, isn't super involved. But I think you look at this wide receiver room, and you look at a guy like Juwan Jennings, who I know had that one monster game, but the 49ers clearly were not confident going into this season with Juwan Jennings as their number 2. That's why they went out. They signed Brandon Ayuk to that extension. Now, I guess you could make the same argument that they weren't confident with Ricky Pearsall being their number 2, number 3, making that move. But I do think there's an opportunity for Ricky Pearsall to come in here, have a rookie breakout. I wasn't even someone who was super high on him as a prospect, but with what I've seen through 2 weeks, I would be optimistic on what he can do moving forward. We just never really know with these rookie wide receivers. They can overperform, they can have these huge games, and then coming off the bye is also a spot where we can see rookies get a bump in usage. So who knows, maybe he comes out week 10 with a more significant role and just continues to roll moving forward. So Ricky Pearsall, definitely someone who I think is interesting, could be a second half breakout candidate. Now we're just going to run through a bunch of handcuff running backs who I think at this point are very, very valuable pickups. Nearly halfway through the season, there aren't going to be a lot of running backs just sitting on the waiver wire that you can play, right away. You're going to need to rely on an injury, but these are players that are probably one injury away from being locked in running back 2s. Some of these guys may be locked in top 10 running backs if the starting guy does go down. So instead of rostering some random committee back who you're never going to start or some random wide receiver who's never going to crack into your lineup, I would be looking at these handcuff guys to, kind of provide a spark if an injury does happen. So starting off here with probably the most valuable handcuff, we have Blake Corum, rostered in 16.8% of leagues. Obviously, the Kyren Williams handcuff. Kyron's played well, but he has also handled a monster workload. I feel like I've talked about this a lot, but it's a huge workload. Kyron's not the largest running back. He's also had some injury history in the past. So if Kyren Williams were to go down, which is not out of the question. Blake Corum could step in, be a top 10 running back right away for fantasy. Another guy who's rostered in 16.8% of leagues, we have Ray Davis. He is the James Cook handcuff. And I think what's kind of cool about Ray Davis is sometimes for these, these handcuffs, these RB2s, you don't necessarily have a large sample size or even any sample size of them coming in with the starter getting injured. Like some of these guys, we're projecting them to maybe be workhorses with an injury. But for Ray Davis, in week 6, we got to see him operate with no James Cook, and he had 23 opportunities, looked really good, with those opportunities that he got. This is an offense you want pieces of, and I think like we already saw, if James Cook goes down, Ray Davis is a really fun option. Then we have Braelon Allen, rostered in 24.7% of leagues. With the Robert Saleh firing, it seemed like under the new regime, even though it was similar coaches, Braelon Allen was not being used as much on a week-to-week basis. He upped that usage here in week 8, 11 of the 27 running back carries. I still don't think he's playable, with his RB2 usage. This is not a good offense. It's not a fun unit to really be a part of at this point. But Breece Hall is still handling a very solid workload. His receiving production, minus yesterday, has been pretty impressive. So I still think Braelon Allen is a top-tier handcuff. I mean, he's the clear running back 2 right now for the Jets. If Breece were to go down, seems very likely that Braelon Allen would be stepping into a huge workload. And then a couple more guys here that are clear handcuffs. We have Kimani Vidal, rostered in 6.6% of leagues. He looks like the J.K. Dobbins handcuff. You look at Dobbins, obviously has a very extensive injury history. Also maybe seems to already be fading at this point. I'm talking about him in my trade video, but he had the monster first 2 weeks. Since then, he has not broken 4 yards per carry. Now, Kimani Vidal also has not been super efficient on the ground, but who knows, injured to J.K. Dobbins, Kimani Vidal could end up being a league winner. Then we have Roschon Johnson, rostered in 12% of leagues. He is the DeAndre Swift handcuff, but actually someone who has a decent role just in terms of a guy getting a decent amount of goal line looks. So if you're like overly desperate in a super picked through league, like Roschon Johnson could at some point slide into your lineup. I obviously wouldn't love it, but the main focus of him is going to be the handcuff upside. Then some unique handcuffs. They're kind of like two-headed handcuffs. The first one is going to be Sean Tucker, who's rostered in 7.5% of leagues. And I think with an injury to Rachaad White or Bucky Irving, Sean Tucker could become playable. We saw, I believe it was week 6, Rachaad White missed. Sean Tucker stepped up, had 14 carries, 3 targets, 34.2 fantasy PPR points. So he absolutely balled out. I think a lot of people thought Bucky Irving was going to turn into the workhorse, but they still wanted to operate this committee. We're still seeing that committee with Rachaad White, Bucky Irving. Sean Tucker is the clear number 3, but I do think that with an injury to either of them, maybe he doesn't have that like RB1 upside because he's not going to become the workhorse, but he could definitely become a running back 3, a flex option, even into RB2 territory in a favorable matchup. And then another guy in a similar situation, we have Jaylen Wright, who's rostered in 7% of leagues. I think with an injury to Achane or Mostert, Jaylen Wright could become fantasy relevant. I think people are forgetting, but coming into the season, like this was a backfield people were very excited about. Both Achane and Mostert were top 5 running backs on a point per game basis last year. So Jaylen Wright, rookie coming in, could he potentially take over with an injury? Could he potentially just straight up overtake Raheem Mostert given his age and a potential fall off? I think, the hype on Jaylen Wright has kind of died down just because the offense was so bad, right? Like it didn't matter if he was the running back 2 with Mostert out. If Tua wasn't at quarterback, there was just no production there. But with Tua back, we saw both these running backs produce. Achane 26.7 PPR points, Raheem Mostert 16. I believe he got into the end zone twice. So they're producing with Tua back. An injury to either of them could open things up here for Jaylen Wright. Now, a very interesting wide receiver who is almost guaranteed to be available in your league. I have Jalen Coker, who is rostered in 0.1% of leagues. So, like I said, pretty much guaranteed to be out there. He was targeted 6 times this week, caught 4 of them for 78 yards and a touchdown. He is an undrafted rookie wide receiver out of Holy Cross. And it seems like he has kind of overtaken first-round pick Xavier Legette in terms of routes. I thought, Legette would be the guy who maybe has that upside second half breakout, potential Deontay Johnson trade. But Jalen Coker seems to have kind of come in and overtaken him, which I think is significant because, most coaching staffs, there's going to be a lot of priority on those early round picks. And we've already seen Jonathan Mingo kind of get phased out of this offense That's not as crazy because he was pretty much, awful last year. And he's not like from the Dave Canales, I guess, era, right? Like Dave Canales did not draft him. He was not handpicked by him, but Xavier Leggett was. And Jalen Coker was second in routes run. He produced with those opportunities. And I think he could become an interesting second half option where Deontay Johnson, does he get moved before the deadline? Obviously, you would want Dalton back at quarterback, but we could have a situation where Jalen Coker is on a second half breakout with Andy Dalton at quarterback and could become fantasy relevant moving forward. I always talk about this. When these young wide receivers show us they're talented, they start to produce, we want to believe them. So if you have space on your bench, I think Jalen Coker is an interesting pickup. Another wide receiver here, we have Elijah Moore, who is rostered in 1.3% of leagues. He ended up leading the team with 12 targets this week, turned that into 8 for 85. I'm not overly high on Elijah Moore just because I do think he's very volume dependent, but I do think he could be like the check down safety blanket for a guy like Jameis Winston. I've been someone who has been very high on Elijah Moore in the past. After his rookie year, I really thought he was going to be like at worst a wide receiver 2 fantasy-wise moving forward. It hasn't panned out, but maybe I was just multiple years early on him and he ends up having a solid finish. Now, the last few players here, it's going to be a couple of quarterbacks and some tight ends who could be streaming options for you, or I guess long-term options, depending on your situation. The first quarterback here, probably more of a streaming play. We have Bo Nix, who is rostered in 36.7% of leagues. He's coming off his best game of the season, probably both from a real-life perspective and fantasy. 284 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, also rushed for a touchdown. He has put up 20-plus fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 games, and he is a very favorable matchup in Week 9, going up against the Ravens. Coming into Week 8, the Ravens had allowed the 3rd most points per game to the quarterback position. They allowed Jameis to go out, have a huge day. So if you need a quarterback to plug and play, Bo Nix could definitely be that guy. Another quarterback who I think is interesting is Matthew Stafford, who's rostered in 18.5% of leagues, and he's been pretty much unplayable early on in the season. But I think now we're in a situation where he has his weapons back. Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua, both returned in Week 8 and both looked pretty good. Like I thought we might get a Kupp return. Then we're hearing he might get traded. We had Puka, who it seemed like he was still at least another week out. We went from them potentially unloading Kupp, kind of punting this year, to now being in the mix within their division and having both these guys healthy. Stafford, with these guys back, went out, threw for 279 yards, 4 passing touchdowns. I think Stafford is a very good NFL quarterback. Now that he has his guys back, I do think he is a viable weekly play. And then now we're going to have a couple of tight end options. The first one's going to be Taysom Hill, rostered in 19.5% of leagues. Returned from injury this week. Had a fine workload, 4 carries, 4 targets, turned it into 2 receptions, and then had 41 total yards. I only think Taysom Hill is playable when Derek Carr is healthy because I think the biggest appeal for Taysom Hill is the goal line usage. Like, I truly do think he will be their goal line back. We saw, I think it was his most recent game he played before he left with injury. He had 2 touchdowns in like the first maybe 20 minutes of that game. So if Derek Carr is back, this offense is looking better. I think Taysom Hill could be playable as a tight end option given that goal line upside. And then the other tight end, Jonnu Smith, rostered in 7.3% of leagues. I talked about him last week. Week 6, Week 7, he had delivered back-to-back solid performances, in weeks where the passing attack, the offense looked awful. So Week 6, he went 5 for 62. Week 7, he went 7 for 96 and a touchdown. The question was, would this carry over with Tua back in the lineup? And he didn't have a great day. 6 targets, 4 receptions for 20 yards. But 6 targets isn't nothing. Not willing to completely give up on Jonnu Smith. Now, do I love him in my lineup? Would I want to plug and play him in Week 9? No, I would not. But I think you could do worse, and just someone to keep an eye on, even if you're not picking him up. But that's going to wrap it up for my top waiver wire targets. If you guys enjoyed the video, hit that like button, subscribe. Any questions, drop them down below. But thank you all for stopping by, and I'll see you in the next one.